7 reasons Antifa is so white. Hashtag AntifaSoWhite. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and after looking at more and more footage of Antifa, who seems to be trying to ensure that their domestic terrorist classified actions will not be forgotten by this winter, I think it's safe to make this simple observation. Hashtag AntifaSoWhite. You know, kind of like Oscar's so white, except Antifa is probably even more white. Now, I'm perfectly aware that this video might attract some attention from fuming vegan bakery workers who will take a rare exception to leave me an angry comment when they are taking a break from looking at itsgoingdown.com, and they'll say 2 things. First, they'll say, Antifa isn't mostly white. What are you talking about? There's totally hella people of color in Antifa. My answer to that is simple. Shut up and stop lying. Everybody can see their little white hands poking out of their reverse KKK costumes, and from the easily observable video evidence all over YouTube, there's seemingly less racial minorities on the Antifa side of things as there are with Patriot Prayer or Proud Boys, usually by a considerable amount, and it's certainly almost exclusively Antifa who starts hurling racialized insults at their political opponents. Secondly, people will tell me, what do you know about Antifa? You're just some right-wing Russian bot that doesn't even know anything about what anarcho-communism really is. To which I say, gee, well, if that were the case, why would you even bother watching my video and leaving me a comment at all? Because clearly nobody would take me seriously if my observations do not correlate to reality in the slightest, right? Truthfully, yes, this video will be based around my own personal speculation and anecdotal experiences, and therefore it is by no means something to be treated as any absolute authority. However, I am somebody that has lived exclusively in cities like New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Oakland. I organized my first progressive leftist protest when I was 14 in 1996, and I have literally played and threw music shows in more venues than I can count, including anarchist squats in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. And so, if I am totally wrong, at least do the comment section a service and tell everybody why I am so wrong precisely. Reason number 1 that Antifa is so white is because accessibility to this type of lifestyle tends to be a lot more common with white people than any other racial demographic in the United States and probably most of Europe, though I know less about Europe, so I will be talking about US Antifa in this video. You see, having the free time to go ahead and do all of this crap is not something that is entirely accessible to many racial minorities. White kids can very often afford to live with many roommates without having to spend all of their time working, as a likely dramatic majority of them do actually get money from their parents, even if they won't admit it, which is where the term trustafarian came from, to describe young white people who pretend to be poor but always have a safety net. These are people that don't have to worry all that much about finding lucrative employment for a few years and thus have access to living a life of veritable LARPing, where they try to smash the system largely due to boredom. Truthfully, I simply don't feel that this is the case with all that many racial minorities, because there aren't that many racial minorities whose parents give them money in this way. Yes, there are definitely Asian Americans with quite a lot of wealth, but from what I've gathered about Asian culture, even from Asian Americans, there is a pretty firm work ethic, and parents are very strict about making sure that their college-aged children are actually doing something with their lives. Thus, it's usually going to be the white kids in the Oakland or Berkeley area that are going around, living in squats, lying to you about being supposedly working class, because if they really were working class, they probably wouldn't have moved to the San Francisco Bay Area at all. Furthermore, black people in particular don't really have access to the squatter lifestyle very often, because if the police see black people going in and out of a house that nobody had been living in for years, they tend to try to put a stop to it. but white kids can get away with it until their parents cut them off and they have to move home or start getting their lives together. Reason number 2 that Antifa is so white is because of universities, and the fact that this Marxist stuff is literally taught at universities that are full of white people. And not all that many racial minorities can afford to go to universities. Simple enough. Now, granted, part of me wants to say that the racial minorities that are at universities would be more likely to become Antifa, but I actually don't really think that that is true for the following reason. Reason number 3 why Antifa is so white is because going out and rioting is generally a lot less risky for white people. So they go ahead and get white women to jump in front of the Proud Boys and talk a bunch of smack, hoping that the white woman gets hit, because then it would prove that the Proud Boys hit women, and then those women sneer and call the cops pigs the whole time. I don't really feel like black people do that so often. Now, I am not entirely sure how much rioting black people can get away with in the current year, but I have this feeling that most black people have at least been raised to legitimately fear the cops as an actual threat to their safety, whereas white people are a lot more likely to just sit around pretending to hate cops when it is trendy, but then call the police for help if there is ever an altercation. Speaking of black people, the 4th reason that Antifa is so white is because it has seemingly replaced Black Lives Matter as the trending far leftist protest of the moment, which is probably getting a lot of money pumped into it, and thus a lot of racial minorities probably simply aren't all that interested because Antifa isn't really geared to be for them. I mean, Black Lives Matter was pretty disorganized and seemingly never intended to actually really accomplish much of anything, but it had one thing going for it: catchy branding. It was sold as a movement to help black people face less violence, which is something that black people do legitimately live in fear of being the victims of. Thus, even though Black Lives Matter was demonizing police officers as if they were a huge, statistically significant source of violence against black people, which if you go by things like the FBI reports simply isn't true if you compare that to the violence of civilians towards other black people, Black Lives Matter still sounded like a great thing simply from the title of the movement. However, then all of a sudden, Black Lives Matter, which remember had already replaced the relatively organic Occupy movement, was basically supposed to be replaced by Antifa, and then presumably, according to the people who actually pay for websites like It's Going Down, black people are seemingly supposed to largely abandon BLM and sign up for Antifa because reasons. Obviously, that's a rather hard sell, because while literally every black person can agree that black lives do, in fact, matter, they certainly can't all agree that the biggest threat to black lives is fascists. And truthfully, being that a lot of black people are unfortunately rather poor and often undereducated, many of them don't really know precisely what fascists actually are. Which isn't really surprising, though, because most white Antifa kids don't really know what fascists are either. The 5th reason that Antifa is so white is because of guilt. This is a good one to follow up reason number 4, because when you think about Black Lives Matter, you have to keep in mind that the white kids who got into it were doing it not because they legitimately felt black people were being killed by police all the time and that it needed to stop, because I'd wager that basically none of them were entirely convinced of that because there wasn't really evidence outside of media hype. However, white leftists do have profound white guilt universally, which will power them far past the feeling of fear of the police, which they probably don't have and black people probably do, and it will turn these white leftists into pure aggression, which might end up inspiring them to regularly instigate violence, which is the case with the Antifa crowd. Now please, don't give me any BS about how Antifa isn't always violent. It is a form of protest or meh. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you aren't showing up to Black Bloc, there's no good reason to actually call yourself Antifa, because there's lots of people who have similar politics to you who don't show up and pepper spray people and sucker punch them. So why call yourself Antifa unless you are one of the bad apples? Maybe stop. Regardless, white guilt is incredibly strong in our nation, and it was exploited by the relentlessly race-baiting administration that just got out of the Oval Office, to the point where a possible majority of white kids under 30 feel an urge to constantly overcompensate and prove how much of an ally to the oppressed they are, and this inspires them to do things that are completely irrational. They aren't just doing it because they think they are defending themselves or their community like black people probably are. These white kids, are proving a point to themselves and to their peers. And that's very different. That's why the white guilt powers aggression, and that's why white kids are willing to show up to Antifa and cause violence, and black people are thinking to themselves, whoa, we were just worried about being shot. Reason number 6 why Antifa is so white is simple insularity, and the fact that there's many more white people who live in complete and utter far leftist echo chambers than there are racial minorities that live in such environments. Seriously, if you have any black friends who actually have any black friends of their own, or who have a relatively normal black family, they will tell you that the dramatic majority of black people aren't particularly PC, and certainly aren't trying to smash the capitalist state to create a communist utopia. No, that attitude is generally something that white people come up with in our nation. Finally, reason number 7 why hashtag AntifaSoWhite is because a huge percentage of these people are actually complete and fairly flagrant bigots. And after a while, that probably starts to rub racial minorities the wrong way. You see, I honestly don't think most racial minorities have a whole lot of respect for some white 19-year-old calling a black Proud Boy an Uncle Tom, as if it's gonna make everybody think that he's down in the hood or something. After long enough of all these white guys generally acting foolish, trash-talking white people while being white, trash-talking racial minorities who aren't on the Antifa side, trash-talking men, trash-talking cis people, and then withdrawing money from the joint account that they share with their parents, and then eventually getting drunk with that money while listening to punk rock, well, most black people eventually probably say, "F this crap, I'm out." In different words. Truthfully, what I think Antifa is really showing us is just how non-committed to actually changing the world for the better the dramatic majority of people who are addicted to protest activism truly are, because they don't really have any integrity, consistency, or even bravery when it comes to how they conduct themselves. They jump from one basically hopeless supposed cause to another and make an entire lifestyle and subculture out of it. And if you hang out with them long enough, which unfortunately I kinda did, you realize pretty clearly that it ironically comes from a place of privilege, and that these people are literally everything they claim to stand against. So really, why the hell else would anybody besides white kids spend much time hanging out with Antifa?